You've got to be out of your damn mind if you think this belongs in first class. The words sliced through the first-class cabin of the commercial airline before the Carters even reached their row. Not a whisper, not a complaint, a verdict. The woman leaned halfway into the aisle, blocking the narrow path, her perfume sharp and invasive, her expression twisted in open contempt as she stared straight at the black family stepping aboard. I mean, honestly, she continued loudly, lips curling. What is this airline coming to? First class used to mean something. Now it's just charity seating with champagne. The father stopped. He was Marcus Carter, 42 years old, dark-skinned, tall and solidly built, dressed in a simple navy sweater, dark jeans, and clean sneakers. Nothing flashy, nothing careless. His posture was calm, grounded, protective. The kind of man who didn't need to announce authority to carry it. His hand rested gently on the shoulder of his son. Beside him stood Elena Carter, 39, deep brown skin, composed, and elegant without excess. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her face controlled, eyes alert. Between them were their two children, quiet, well-behaved, holding backpacks close, already shrinking under attention they did not ask for. They hadn't spoken loudly. They hadn't delayed boarding. They hadn't broken a single rule. And yet the woman looked at them like a stain. She was Victoria. Langford, 51, pale-skinned, wrapped in tailored designer clothes and expensive jewelry that caught the cabin lights with every exaggerated movement. A self-declared millionaire. The kind of woman who treated money like proof of superiority and silence like submission. She scoffed and turned to the nearest flight attendant. "Excuse me," she snapped. "Are you seriously letting them sit here? Because if that's airline policy now, someone needs to explain when standards officially died." The flight attendant froze for half a second, just long enough. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "all passengers in first class have valid tickets." Victoria let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Oh, please. Tickets get mixed up. People slip through. I've seen this trick before." Her eyes slid back to the children. They don't even know how to act like this is their world. A few nearby passengers shifted in their seats. No one spoke. Marcus's jaw tightened once, then relaxed. "We're just boarding," he said evenly. "Like everyone else." Victoria leaned closer, voice dropping into something colder. "That calm voice doesn't fool me. You people always think acting polite makes you invisible." She smirked. "But it doesn't change the fact that this is first class. Not some public waiting room." Elena felt her daughter's fingers tighten around her hand. Victoria wasn't finished. "I pay a fortune to sit up here," she continued loudly, making sure the surrounding rows heard her. "I expect peace, professionalism, and people who belong. Not kids who are going to cry, touch everything, and turn this cabin into daycare at 30,000 feet. That's enough, ma'am," the flight attendant tried. "No, it's not," Victoria snapped. "Because passenger rights go both ways, and my right is not having my space invaded by people who clearly stretched to be here." The word "stretched" hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus slowly reached into his jacket and handed over their boarding passes. The attendant scanned them. Green lights, confirmed seats, row 2. Victoria stared at the screen, annoyed rather than corrected. "So," she pressed, "you're really going to tell me airline policy says I have to tolerate this? Because I know how these policies work. They're flexible when the airline wants good press." Her gaze hardened. "And let's be honest," she added, lowering her voice just enough to be cruel. "We both know if someone like me complained loudly enough, these seats would magically open up." The flight attendant swallowed. "Ma'am, under airline policy, any passenger with a valid ticket." "Oh, spare me the script," Victoria interrupted. "Those rules are written for people who don't have influence. I do." She turned directly to Marcus now. "You really should be grateful," she said with a thin smile. "Most people would know better than to push their luck like this." Marcus met her gaze. His voice didn't rise. "Our children are quiet. We follow the rules. We paid for these seats." Victoria laughed outright, sharp and ugly. "Paid?" She tilted her head. "Sweetheart, I spend more on airport lounges than your entire family probably makes in a year. Don't insult my intelligence." A man across the aisle looked away. A woman 2 rows back pretended to adjust her bag. No one intervened. Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "I want this documented," she said to the attendant. "If anything goes wrong on this flight, I want it clear that I raised concerns about who you allowed into first class. There it was. Not safety, not order. Preemptive blame." The attendant hesitated, then nodded. "I'll make a note." Victoria smiled. "Good. Because when this turns into chaos, I won't be the one taking responsibility." Her eyes flicked to the children. "Some people just don't know their place until someone reminds them." Elena felt the heat rise in her chest. She lowered her eyes instead, not in shame, but restraint. A verse surfaced in her mind, steady as breath. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Psalm 34, 1-8. They moved toward their seats. The humiliation followed them like a shadow. The boarding door closed behind them. Victoria leaned back, satisfied, convinced she had drawn the line and won. She had no idea what she had just started. If you've ever been judged the moment you walked into a room, if you've ever felt your dignity questioned before you spoke a word, then what happens next on this flight will shake you. Like, subscribe, and stay with Dignity Voices, because this story is about to expose what privilege does when it goes too far. When entitlement meets silence, how far will the system allow it to go? The aircraft door sealed with a dull, final thud. That sound, soft, mechanical, irreversible, shifted the balance of power. Victoria Langford noticed it immediately. She straightened in her seat, adjusted the silk scarf at her neck, and exhaled like someone who had just closed a deal. With the plane now fully boarded, her confidence sharpened. There would be no easy exits, no quiet corrections. Whatever happened next would unfold in the air, contained, controlled, and deniable. She leaned slightly toward the aisle and pressed the call button. Once, twice. The chime sounded polite, almost apologetic. A senior flight attendant approached, posture stiff, expression neutral. "Yes, ma'am?" Victoria lowered her voice, but not enough to be private. "I want to formally express discomfort," she said. "Not a complaint, a concern." The word was chosen carefully. The attendant nodded, already bracing. "I travel first class regularly," Victoria continued. "I understand how airline policy works, and I know when something isn't right. I raised this before departure, and I don't feel my concern was taken seriously." Her eyes flicked, deliberately, toward the Carters. "I don't believe this seating situation aligns with the standards promised to passengers like me." The attendant hesitated. "Ma'am, all passengers here have tickets," Victoria interrupted smoothly. "Yes, you said that already. But tickets don't erase risk." The word hung heavy. "What kind of risk?" the attendant asked carefully. Victoria sighed, as if tired of explaining something obvious. "Unpredictability, disruption, conflict, children in confined premium spaces." She paused. And frankly, misrepresentation. The attendant's lips pressed together. Are you alleging fraud, ma'am? Victoria smiled faintly. I'm saying I've seen people stretch the rules before. And when something goes wrong mid-flight, it's the airline that pays the price. I'm trying to help you avoid that. She gestured toward Marcus and Elena again. I've already noticed tension. If there's an incident, I don't want my name anywhere near it. The implication was clear. Deal with them now, or deal with consequences later. The attendant glanced toward the cockpit, then back to the Carters. I'll need to document this, she said. Victoria's smile deepened. Of course, transparency protects everyone. A second attendant joined them. Then a third, the purser. The cluster of uniforms drew attention. Passengers began to watch openly now. Marcus felt it before he saw it, the subtle shift from individual hostility to institutional pressure. He placed his hand gently on his son's knee, grounding him. Sir, the purser said, voice practiced. We need to ask a few questions. About what? Marcus asked calmly. There's been a concern raised regarding cabin suitability and compliance. Elena looked up. Our children are seated, buckled, and quiet, she said evenly. We've followed every instruction. The purser nodded, but his eyes slid past her. May we recheck your boarding passes and identification? Marcus handed them over without protest. Phones appeared. Someone 2 rows back began recording not out of malice, but curiosity. Victoria leaned back, arms folded, watching with open satisfaction. The passes were scanned again. Valid. Confirmed. But the process didn't stop. The purser conferred quietly with the attendants. Victoria pressed the call button again. Just so you're aware, she said loudly, passenger rights include the right to a safe and appropriate environment. If something escalates on this flight, I will hold the airline accountable. Marcus turned slightly. Ma'am, he said calmly, we haven't spoken to you since boarding. Victoria smiled thinly. Exactly. The purser cleared his throat. We're going to ask you to step into the aisle briefly, he said to Marcus and Elena. This is just a procedural check. Is that required? Marcus asked. It would help us resolve the situation, the purser replied. Help, whom was left unsaid. They stood. The aisle felt narrow now. Exposed. Passengers stared openly. Some with sympathy, others with judgment, most with silence. The children remained seated, eyes wide. Victoria crossed her legs slowly. There, she murmured. That's better. The purser lowered his voice. There's been a suggestion that relocating your family might reduce tension. Relocating where? Elena asked. The purser hesitated. There are still seats in business class. Marcus looked at him steadily. Our tickets are for first class. Yes, but this would be temporary, the purser said. A compromise. Victoria laughed softly. See? Solutions. Marcus understood now. This wasn't about rules. It was about comfort hers. About proving who could bend the system by pressing hard enough. We won't move, Marcus said calmly. The purser stiffened. If you refuse, sir, I'll have to note non-cooperation. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Isn't that interesting, she said. Refusing to cooperate already. Marcus felt his daughter's gaze on him. He knelt slightly, bringing his eyes level with hers. It's okay, he whispered. Stay seated. He stood again. We are cooperating, he said. We're also exercising our rights. The purser exhaled sharply. I'll need to escalate this. He turned toward the cockpit. That was the moment. The moment when inconvenience turned into threat. Victoria leaned forward. You know, she said casually. "I've seen flights diverted for less. If there's tension on board, the captain has to act." The words were light. The impact was not. Elena felt something inside her crack, not loudly, but deeply. She lowered her eyes again. A verse surfaced in her mind, steady, anchoring. "When justice is done, it brings joy to the righteous, but terror to evildoers." Proverbs 21:15. The purser returned. "For the duration of the flight," he said carefully, "we're asking that you remain seated and limit interaction. Any further disturbance will be documented." Marcus nodded. Victoria smiled. She had framed them as the risk. The plane began to taxi. As engines roared, Victoria settled back, victorious. The Carters sat in silence. The system had chosen a side. For now. The seatbelt sign chimed on as the plane climbed. That sound meant for safety felt like confinement. Victoria Langford watched the altitude number rise on the seatback screen and smiled to herself. At 30,000 feet, consequences felt far away. Policies became flexible. Authority narrowed. Complaints became weapons. She pressed the call button again. This time, she didn't wait. "I need the purser," she said sharply as the attendant approached. "Now." The purser arrived with the same professional stiffness, but something had changed. His patience was thinner. The cockpit door was sealed. The flight was committed. Victoria lowered her voice, just enough to sound reasonable. "I've been monitoring the situation," she said, "and it's escalating." The purser frowned. "In what way, ma'am?" Victoria gestured suddenly toward the Carters. "They're whispering. The kids keep turning around. There's tension." She paused. "I don't feel safe." Marcus looked up. "We haven't spoken," he said calmly. "My children are seated and buckled." Victoria didn't look at him. "That's your perspective," she said coolly. "Mine is different." She leaned closer to the purser. "If something happens mid-flight," she continued, "it becomes a liability issue. And from what I can tell, the airline already ignored warning signs before takeoff." The word ignored landed with weight. The purser straightened. "What are you suggesting, ma'am?" "I'm suggesting you intervene before this turns into an incident," Victoria replied. "Because when lawyers get involved, they don't care about intentions. They care about records." The purser exhaled slowly. "Sir," he said to Marcus, "we're going to need you to step into the galley for a moment." "For what reason?" Marcus asked. "To de-escalate," the purser replied. Marcus didn't move. "My children will not be separated from me," he said evenly. Victoria scoffed. "See? Defensive already." Elena felt her pulse quicken. "This is unnecessary," she said calmly. "We've done nothing wrong." The purser hesitated, then made a decision. "Sir," he said, voice firm now, "if you refuse to comply with crew instructions, it may be documented as non-compliance under airline policy." There it was. The quiet threat. Passengers leaned forward. A phone camera rose again. Marcus stood slowly. "I'll step into the galley," he said, "but my family stays seated." Victoria smiled faintly. "Progress." As Marcus moved forward, the purser gestured to another attendant. "Please monitor the children." The attendant hovered near Elena, and the kids too close, too watchful. Elena felt the humiliation burn. Her daughter whispered, "Mom, did we do something bad?" "No," Elena said softly. "Absolutely not." Victoria crossed her legs and spoke loudly enough for the row to hear. "This is exactly why people like this don't belong in premium cabins. Always something. Always drama." Elena looked up. "Please stop speaking about us," she said, voice controlled but shaking. Victoria tilted her head. "Freedom of speech," she replied lightly. unless airline policy says otherwise. In the galley, Marcus stood with the purser and a flight attendant. "We just want to ensure a calm flight," the purser said. "By singling us out?" Marcus asked. "By responding to concerns." "Concerns based on what?" Marcus pressed. "Behavior? Noise? Safety?" The purser didn't answer, because there wasn't one. Back in the cabin, Victoria wasn't finished. She leaned toward Elena again. "You should be grateful," she said quietly. "Most families like yours don't get warnings. They just get escorted." Elena's hands trembled slightly. She folded them together. A verse surfaced in her mind, steadying her breath. "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Exodus 14, 1-4. Minutes passed. Marcus returned to his seat. His face was calm, but something had changed. The attendants now watched them openly. Every movement of the children was tracked. Every whisper noted. When Elena reached into her bag, an attendant leaned closer. Victoria pressed the call button again. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said loudly. "Look at this. Unstable environment." "That's enough," Elena said quietly. Victoria smiled. "Or what?" The purser returned. "Ma'am," he said to Victoria, "we've documented your concerns." "And?" she asked. "And we'll continue monitoring." Victoria sighed dramatically. "So, no real action. Typical." She glanced toward Marcus. "If something happens, this is on you." Marcus met her gaze. "For the record," he said evenly, "we have done nothing except exist." Victoria laughed. "Existence isn't the issue," she replied. "Entitlement is." The plane shuddered lightly with turbulence. The cabin lights flickered. Somewhere between clouds and pressure, the line was crossed. What happened next would later be reviewed not as discomfort, but as evidence, as corporate negligence, as a failure to protect passenger rights equally, as a moment when a commercial airline chose appeasement over principle and created a trail that would demand legal accountability. But none of that was visible yet. All anyone could see was a family sitting still, absorbing humiliation, and a woman who believed altitude meant immunity. She was wrong. If you've ever watched someone weaponize rules to break another person's dignity, stay with us. Like and subscribe to Dignity Voices, because what happens after this flight lands will expose everything. When the cabin falls silent and the doors finally open, who will the system protect next? Cruising altitude smoothed the cabin into a deceptive calm. The engines settled into a steady hum, the kind meant to reassure passengers that everything was under control. Drinks were served, lights dimmed, conversations resumed in whispers. But for Marcus and Elena, the air felt heavier now than it had during boarding. This was the part no one talked about. Not the insult, not the accusation, but the after, when the system pretended nothing had happened, when humiliation was left to echo quietly inside the people forced to endure it. An attendant stopped by their row, smile fixed, eyes watchful. "Can I get you anything?" she asked. Her tone was polite. Her posture was not. Marcus shook his head. "No, thank you." She lingered a moment longer than necessary, then moved on. Victoria Langford noticed everything. She sipped her champagne slowly, savoring it, her gaze drifting back toward the Carters, with thinly veiled satisfaction. In her mind, the situation had already resolved itself. The family had been marked. The crew had responded. The hierarchy had been restored. This was how power worked. Not loudly, efficiently. Elena kept her eyes forward, her expression composed. But inside, Her thoughts moved carefully, deliberately, like pieces being set into place. She replayed the moments in sequence, not emotionally, but clinically. The accusation, the repeated checks, the isolation of Marcus in the galley, the attendants hovering over the children, the documentation. Every detail mattered, because silence wasn't surrender. It was memory. Marcus felt it too, the shift from endurance to clarity. He wasn't angry. Anger would have clouded what came next. What he felt instead was something colder, steadier, recognition. The crew wasn't acting out of malice. They were acting out of fear. Fear of complaint. Fear of escalation. Fear of a woman who knew exactly how to threaten without raising her voice. That fear had overridden training, overridden fairness, overridden common sense, and fear, once documented, became evidence. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and authoritative. "We'll be cruising at this altitude for the next 2 hours. If you need anything, our crew is here to assist." Victoria smiled faintly. Assist. That word again. She leaned toward the aisle and murmured to the man beside her, not caring if others heard. Some people really don't understand how things work until they're reminded. Marcus heard it. He didn't react. Instead, he adjusted his watch, an unconscious habit. Elena noticed. She always did. That was his signal. Focus. Elena reached into her bag slowly and removed a small notebook. To anyone watching, it looked like distraction. A way to calm herself. She opened it. Inside were neat lines of handwriting, not notes from this flight, but reminders, habits, grounding truths. She added a single line at the bottom of the page. Row 2, multiple attendants. Timestamps approximate. Then she closed the notebook and returned it to her bag. Victoria watched, curious now. She leaned slightly forward. Writing a complaint? She asked lightly. Elena met her gaze for the first time since boarding. No, she said softly. Remembering, Victoria laughed. Good luck with that. Elena looked away again. The cabin settled into routine. Meals were served. Trays clinked. Screens flickered to life. But the Carters were no longer participants in the flight. They were observers. When an attendant leaned too close to their children, Marcus noticed. When another whispered to the purser while glancing at their row, Elena noticed. When a third avoided eye contact entirely, they both noticed. This was how negligence happened. Not in explosions, but patterns. The children remained quiet, obedient, confused. At one point, Marcus's son whispered, Dad, why are they watching us? Marcus leaned in. Because sometimes, he said gently, people mistake calm for weakness. The boy nodded slowly, not fully understanding, but trusting. Elena felt something tighten in her chest. She closed her eyes briefly. A verse surfaced again, not loud, not dramatic, but firm. Better is one who is slow to anger than a mighty warrior, and one who controls his temper than one who takes a city. Proverbs 16:32. She breathed it in. Victoria shifted in her seat, irritation creeping in. The family hadn't broken. They hadn't lashed out. They hadn't begged. They had gone quiet. That unsettled her. She pressed the call button again. Yes? The attendant asked. I just want it noted, Victoria said, voice smooth, that I still feel tension back here. If there's any disruption, I expect immediate action. The attendant nodded. We're monitoring, ma'am. Monitoring. Marcus almost smiled, because monitoring worked both ways. Time passed. The plane sliced through clouds, indifferent to the small moral failure unfolding inside it. The Carters sat still, letting the moment fully reveal itself, not rushing to escape discomfort, not grasping for validation. They didn't need witnesses, they needed accuracy. By the time the descent announcement sounded, something irreversible had occurred, not externally, but internally. This was no longer about humiliation. It was about record. The wheels touched down with a muted thump. The cabin exhaled. Victoria straightened, satisfied again. She gathered her belongings with the confidence of someone who believed the story ended here. Marcus and Elena exchanged a look, not of relief, of readiness. The doors would open soon, and silence carefully held, carefully documented, was about to speak. The aircraft door opened with a soft hydraulic sigh. Applause rippled briefly through the cabin, the reflexive relief of landing. Phones powered back on. Seatbelts clicked open. The ritual of escape began. Victoria Langford stood immediately. She reached for her handbag with practiced confidence, already half-turned toward the aisle, certain the story was over. Conflicts in the air, she believed, evaporated on the ground. Gravity returned things to their proper order. Behind her, Marcus and Elena remained seated, not delayed, not hesitant, intentional. An attendant appeared near the cockpit door, not the same one from before. Older, straighter posture, different demeanor. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said calmly, "please remain seated for a moment." A few groans rose. Victoria rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on," she muttered. "What now?" The attendant's gaze found Marcus. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," she said evenly, "would you please gather your belongings and follow me?" The cabin went still. Victoria froze. She turned slowly, her expression flickering, not fear yet, but irritation. "Excuse me?" she said. "Why are they being escorted?" The attendant didn't look at her. "This won't take long," she said. "Thank you for your patience." Marcus stood, helping his children to their feet. Elena adjusted her daughter's jacket. Their movements were calm, almost ceremonial. As they stepped into the aisle, the purser reappeared, then two men in dark suits waiting just beyond the jet bridge. Not security, not customer service, corporate. Victoria's smile faltered. "Is this some kind of joke?" she asked loudly. "Because I've been raising concerns this entire flight, and no one has spoken to me." One of the men in suits turned slightly. "Ma'am," he said politely, "we'll be speaking with you shortly as well." That word "shortly" landed differently now. The Carters were led past the first row, past the galley, through the jet bridge, and into a private corridor Victoria had never noticed before. Behind a frosted glass door, the atmosphere changed completely. Quiet, controlled, deliberate. Inside the room waited three people: a senior airline compliance officer, a legal counsel, and a regional operations executive. Tablets rested on the table. Screens glowed with paused footage. Marcus and Elena took their seats. No one rushed them. "Thank you for waiting," the compliance officer said. "We'll be brief." She tapped her screen. "This flight has been flagged for review." Elena nodded slightly. "For what reason?" Marcus asked. "For multiple procedural deviations," the officer replied. "And a formal complaint filed mid-flight alleging risk, non-compliance, and passenger disturbance." Elena met her gaze. "Filed by whom?" The officer didn't hesitate. "Miss Victoria Langford." Elena exhaled slowly. "And the deviations?" Marcus asked. The legal counsel spoke this time. "Crew actions inconsistent with policy. Selective enforcement. Failure to protect passenger dignity." He paused. "And failure to intervene appropriately once discriminatory behavior was documented." Silence filled the room, not awkward, but weighty. On the screen behind them, Video began to play. Boarding footage. The aisle confrontation. Marcus stepping into the galley. The attendant hovering over the children. Elena watched without blinking. "This footage," the compliance officer said, "combined with cabin logs, audio records, and witness statements, indicates a pattern." "A pattern of what?" Marcus asked calmly. The operations executive folded his hands. "Corporate exposure." That was when the door opened again. Victoria Langford entered. She was no longer smiling. "What is this?" she demanded. "Why am I being pulled aside like I did something wrong?" She looked at Marcus and Elena, then scoffed. "Oh, this is ridiculous. I was the one being inconvenienced." The legal counsel gestured toward an empty chair. "Miss Langford, please sit." She didn't. "I've already contacted my attorney," she snapped, "and I expect compensation for this entire experience." The compliance officer remained unmoved. "Miss Langford," she said evenly, "you invoked safety concerns repeatedly during this flight." "Yes," Victoria said sharply. "Because there was tension," the officer nodded, "and those concerns were investigated." She tapped her tablet again. "The investigation does not support your claims." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means," the legal counsel said, "that your statements are on record, and they contradict objective evidence." He slid a document across the table. "This outlines the findings so far." Victoria glanced at it and stiffened. Her elite status, her complaint history, her recorded statements. "You accuse this family of being unsafe," the counsel continued. "You pressured crew members to isolate them. You encouraged deviation from policy." Victoria scoffed. "I was advocating for my rights." "And in doing so," the compliance officer said calmly, "you violated theirs." Victoria laughed, brittle. "Are you seriously siding with them?" The operations executive finally spoke. "Miss Langford," he said, "do you know who you're speaking to?" Victoria turned toward him. "I know who I am." He nodded. "Yes, we know that too." He turned to Marcus and Elena. "And we know who you are." Victoria frowned. "What is that supposed to mean?" The executive clasped his hands. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter are principal private investors in this airline. They joined during restructuring, when liquidity was uncertain and public confidence was low." Victoria's mouth opened, then closed. "They sit on no public board," he continued. "They don't advertise their involvement, but their capital preserved roots, staff positions, and operational continuity." He looked directly at her. "Including this flight." The room went silent. Victoria laughed weakly. "That's not funny." No one joined her. "This review," the compliance officer said, "will continue. Miss Langford, your status with this airline is under immediate suspension pending outcome." "What?" Victoria snapped. "You can't do that." "We already have," the counsel replied. "Your privileges are revoked effective now." Victoria's face flushed. "This is discrimination," she said desperately. Marcus spoke for the first time since the reveal. "No," he said calmly. "This is accountability." Elena lowered her gaze, whispering a verse she had carried all flight. "For there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open." Luke 8:17. Victoria stood frozen. For the first time, she had no leverage. The compliance officer closed her tablet. "This meeting is concluded." As Marcus and Elena stood, the power in the room followed them, not because they demanded it, but because it had always been theirs. Victoria remained behind, alone. If you've ever wondered what happens when quiet dignity finally meets the truth, stay with us. Like and subscribe to Dignity Voices, because the next chapter delivers justice in motion. When the system turns and consequences begin to fall, how far will accountability reach? The room emptied slowly, not with panic, with recalibration. That was how real power moved, not in chaos, but in quiet reordering. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Tablets were collected. Doors closed with deliberate care. Every sound felt precise, intentional, as if the space itself had shifted allegiance. Victoria Langford remained standing. She had not been dismissed. She had been contained. Across the table, Marcus and Elena sat calmly as a new group entered the room, this time without introductions. They didn't need them. Their posture, their silence, the way they placed documents down before speaking said everything. Compliance, risk, legal, operations. The system had assembled itself. The senior compliance officer spoke first. This is no longer a customer. Relations matter, she said evenly. It's a governance issue, Victoria scoffed, but her voice lacked conviction now. You're overreacting, she said. I made a complaint. That's my right. The legal counsel nodded once. You exercised a right, he said, and then exceeded it. He tapped the screen in front of him. You alleged safety risks without evidence. You repeatedly pressured crew members to act outside policy. You encouraged isolation of passengers based on subjective discomfort. Victoria crossed her arms. I was advocating for standards, and in doing so, the counsel replied, you triggered a sequence of violations that exposed this airline to liability. The words settled heavily. Liability. The operations executive leaned forward. Let's be very clear, Miss Langford. This airline operates under federal aviation regulations, civil rights statutes, and internal policy frameworks. What occurred on board today is now classified as a material incident. Victoria blinked. What does that mean? It means, the executive continued, that this incident must be reported, reviewed, and addressed at the corporate level. Elena watched Victoria closely now, not with satisfaction, but observation. This was the moment when entitlement finally met structure. The compliance officer slid a printed document across the table. This is a summary of immediate actions. Victoria glanced down and stiffened. Elite status. Suspended indefinitely. Access privileges revoked. Formal notation placed in internal partner systems. Complaint activity flagged for abuse. You can't blacklist me, Victoria snapped. I fly with half your partners. The officer didn't flinch. We didn't blacklist you, she said. We reclassified you, the legal counsel continued. In addition, we are initiating corrective action regarding the crew involved. Victoria looked up sharply. What does that have to do with me? Everything, the counsel replied. Your behavior created pressure. The crew's response failed policy safeguards. Both are under review. Marcus spoke, then not loudly, not forcefully. This isn't about punishment, he said. It's about correction. Victoria turned to him, disbelief etched across her face. You're enjoying this, she accused. Marcus met her gaze evenly. No, he said. We're documenting it. The compliance officer nodded. As of now, she said, this airline is activating what we internally refer to as a justice protocol. Victoria scoffed. That's not a real thing. It is, the officer replied calmly. It's what happens when a system recognizes its own failure. She tapped her tablet again. Crew members who deviated from policy will be placed on immediate administrative leave pending retraining or separation. Victoria's breath hitched. You're ruining people's lives because I complained? No, the officer said evenly. We're correcting corporate negligence before it becomes culture. The room went still. That phrase, corporate negligence, hung like a verdict. The operations executive turned to Marcus and Elena. You have the right, he said, to pursue civil action, to remain anonymous, or to require structural reform. Elena considered this carefully. What reforms? She asked. The executive gestured to a screen now displaying a draft document. Mandatory bias intervention protocols, complaint verification thresholds, passenger rights reinforcement training, escalation safeguards against effect. Coercive influence, Marcus nodded slowly. These should have existed already, he said. They should have, the executive agreed. They didn't. Victoria stood there, shrinking not physically, but socially. The language had changed. The room no longer responded to her tone, her money, her indignation. She was just present. And my compensation? She asked weakly. For being inconvenienced? The legal counsel looked at her steadily. There will be no compensation. Victoria laughed once. Hollow. You're choosing them over me. The counsel corrected her. We're choosing the policy over you. Silence. Elena leaned forward slightly. You were never in danger, she said softly. But you made us one. Victoria's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, she seemed to understand the scale of what she had done, not morally, but practically. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a record. The compliance officer stood. This concludes the internal review for today. Miss Langford, you will be contacted regarding further findings. Victoria snapped. I'm not finished. The officer met her gaze. You are. Security didn't escort her out. They didn't need to. She left alone. When the door closed behind her, the room felt lighter. Not victorious. Corrected. The operations executive turned to Marcus and Elena. There will be no press statement unless you request one, he said. This will be handled internally. Marcus nodded. That's sufficient, Elena added quietly. But the policies make sure they're real. They will be, the executive said. They already are. As the meeting concluded, Marcus and Elena stood. The power did not linger in the room. It followed them. Outside, the terminal buzzed with normalcy, rolling suitcases, boarding calls, coffee orders. No one knew what had just shifted. No one applauded. Justice rarely announced itself. As they walked toward the exit, Elena felt the tension finally ease from her shoulders. Not relief. Alignment, she whispered softly. More to herself than anyone else. Let justice roll on like a river. Righteousness like a never-failing stream. Amos 5:2-4. Marcus squeezed her hand. They didn't look back, because the system was already moving forward, rewritten, recalibrated, corrected. And this time, it would remember. The collapse did not come with sirens. It came with silence. The kind that followed after decisions had already been made, after doors had closed, after signatures dried. The kind of silence that didn't ask permission. Within 12 hours of the flight, the first internal notice was released, not broadly, not publicly. It landed only in executive inboxes and compliance channels. Subject: post-flight incident review. Immediate actions, no adjectives, no emotion, just intent. Crew scheduling systems updated quietly. Names disappeared from upcoming rotations. Access badges failed to scan at staff entrances the next morning, forcing confused employees to step aside while supervisors avoided eye contact. Administrative leave. That phrase echoed through the airline's internal corridors like a held breath. By the afternoon, Training calendars were wiped clean and rebuilt. Mandatory sessions appeared where flexibility used to exist. Attendance was no longer a suggestion. Cameras were installed in rooms that had never needed them before, because now documentation mattered. At headquarters, a secondary review began, one that extended beyond the single flight. Analysts pulled historical complaint data and laid it across multiple years, searching for repetition. It didn't take long. The pattern emerged like a watermark. Same language, same escalation tactics, same demographic targets, same outcomes. A compliance analyst paused the screen and leaned back. "This isn't isolated," she said quietly. No one argued. The issue had never been lack of data. It had been lack of will. A closed-door meeting followed. No assistants, no phones. Just people who understood what exposure meant. One executive spoke first. "If this reaches discovery," he said, "we don't get to say we didn't know." Another nodded. "That window closed today." "Across the table," legal counsel added, "the risk isn't reputational anymore. It's structural." That was the word that changed everything. Structural. It meant policy rewrite. It meant leadership, accountability. It meant permanence. By the end of the meeting, 3 departments had new directives: complaint handling, crew escalation authority, passenger dignity enforcement. None of the language referenced race. None of it needed to. The corrections were surgical. Meanwhile, the consequences reached Victoria Langford more slowly, but more deeply. At first, she noticed the absence of familiarity. Her usual lounge access denied. Her preferred boarding group reassigned. Staff no longer recognized her name, no longer smiled preemptively, no longer moved aside when she approached. She was still wealthy, but she was no longer accommodated. When she called customer relations, the response was precise, detached. "Your account status is under review." "When will that be resolved?" she demanded. "There is no timeline," the representative replied. Victoria laughed sharply. "You can't leave me in limbo." The representative didn't respond, because they could. She contacted her attorney again. This time, the tone was different. "They've insulated themselves," he said. "Private carriers, internal codes, no public violation. So they just get away with it?" She snapped. "No," he replied carefully. "They corrected the problem." Victoria hung up. Correction. The word tasted like dismissal. Back at the airline, the correction widened. A supervisor who had hesitated during the flight was formally reassigned, not punished, not fired, repositioned away from decision authority. The message was clear. Hesitation is participation. Another attendant requested counseling. She hadn't realized how far she'd leaned into pressure until it was documented in plain language. Seeing her actions described neutrally had shaken her. She didn't argue the report. She accepted it. In training sessions, the flight was referenced anonymously. "This is what failure looks like," the instructor said calmly. "Not malice, compliance without thought." Hands rose. "What if the passenger is high status?" The instructor didn't hesitate. "Then policy matters more." That line landed, not loudly, permanently. Marcus and Elena learned none of this in real time. They were home, present, ordinary again. Their children returned to school without knowing that anything beyond discomfort had occurred. That was intentional. Elena had insisted on it. "They don't need the wait," she said. Marcus agreed. The phone call came days later, short, factual. "The review is complete," the operations executive said. "Reforms are live. Oversight has been reassigned." "And Miss Langford?" Marcus asked. There was a pause, not hesitation, but confirmation. She no longer has leverage. That was enough. When the call ended, Marcus sat quietly for a long time. Not triumphant, resolved. Elena joined him. "Do you feel better?" she asked. "No," he said honestly. "I feel accurate." She nodded. Accuracy was peace. The system continued correcting itself long after public interest would have moved on if there had been any. Annual reviews were rewritten, metrics adjusted, incentives realigned. Staff learned that silence could be recorded just as clearly as words. A junior executive lost a promotion not because of this flight directly, but because the culture that allowed it had his fingerprints on it. He never knew why. He just felt the ceiling lower. At a partner airline, an internal advisory circulated quietly. Status-based complaints require corroboration, no explanation, no reference, but the ripple spread. Victoria attempted to book an international flight months later. Her itinerary populated, then vanished. A message appeared. Manual review required. She stared at the screen. For the first time in her adult life, she waited. No concierge line, no override, no shortcut, just process. That was the punishment. Not humiliation, not exposure, irrelevance. At home, Marcus watched his children play. Loud and free. Elena leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, a small smile resting where tension used to live. She remembered a verse her mother had whispered to her once. Long before planes and boardrooms mattered. The righteous care about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern. Proverbs 29:7. Justice hadn't shouted. It hadn't needed witnesses. It had simply rearranged the world so that harm became expensive and dignity became protected by default. The collapse was complete, not because someone fell, but because something false could no longer stand. 3 months passed. Not enough time for the world to forget, but enough time for the noise to fade. Marcus stood at the airport window, hands in his coat pockets, watching aircraft taxi across the runway. The movement was steady, almost meditative. Engines roared, then softened. Departures layered over arrivals in a choreography so familiar it felt timeless. Elena stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his. The terminal had changed, not visibly, not in ways most travelers would notice. The same branding, the same announcements, the same uniforms. But something beneath the surface had shifted, like a building reinforced after an earthquake. They felt it immediately. At check-in, the agent looked up and smiled, not the rehearsed smile of obligation, but something warmer. "Good morning," she said. "Welcome." No hesitation, no scanning twice, no quiet calculation, just welcome. Their children stood close, older somehow, steadier. They didn't carry fear into this space anymore. They carried routine. That mattered. As they moved toward security, Marcus's phone buzzed. He didn't rush to answer it. He waited until they were seated near the gate. Gate 14, the same number as before. The coincidence wasn't lost on him. The message was brief. Final documents executed. Settlement agreement confirmed. No public disclosure required. He exhaled slowly. Elena glanced at him. "It's done?" she asked. "Yes," he said, formally. The settlement agreement had been clean. No spectacle, no press, no victory lap. Just acknowledgement, accountability, and reform. Money had never been the point. Structure had. Part of the agreement required a written executive apology not to be published, not to be performed, but to be recorded internally and distributed to staff as part of retraining. Marcus had read it once. It hadn't been eloquent, but it had been honest. We failed to protect dignity. We deferred where we should have intervened. We will not repeat this. That was enough. Across the terminal, a familiar logo shimmered above a coffee stand. Same colors. Same promise. But now, attached to it were internal policies no passenger would ever see. Brand accountability, implemented quietly. That was the real legacy. Elena watched their children laughing softly at something on a phone screen. They won't remember the humiliation, she said. Marcus nodded. But they'll grow up in a system that learned from it. A pause settled between them. What about her? Elena asked gently. Marcus didn't ask who. She's not part of our story anymore, he said. Victoria Langford had disappeared from their lives without ceremony. They'd heard indirectly that her attempts at reputation management had stalled not because anyone attacked her, but because nothing needed defending. When access disappears quietly, reputation follows. No headlines, no shame spiral, just absence. That was consequence. An announcement chimed. Now boarding Group 1. Marcus stood, then paused. He looked around the terminal at strangers moving through their own invisible battles, their own moments of dignity tested or affirmed. This was the truth few stories showed. Justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it recalibrated. As they boarded, an attendant stepped aside and gestured them forward. Welcome back, she said. 2 simple words. Elena felt something in her chest ease, something she hadn't realized she was still holding. They reached their comment. Seats. First class. Same layout. Same leather. Different weight. Marcus buckled his seatbelt and looked out the window. The sky was clear today, no turbulence forecasted. Elena rested her head back briefly, closing her eyes. A verse surfaced in her mind, not dramatic, not heavy, just true. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Micah 6:8. She opened her eyes. This was mercy, not forgiveness, that erased accountability, but peace that followed it. The plane pushed back from the gate. As it moved, Marcus felt no urge to look around, no need to scan faces. They didn't need validation. They had alignment. At altitude, Elena reached for his hand. I'm glad we didn't speak that day, she said quietly. Marcus nodded. Silence told the truth, better than words ever could. Outside the window, clouds parted. Sunlight poured across the wing, unbothered by what it reflected. Justice had landed softly, and it stayed. If this story moved you, ask yourself this. What would change if dignity were protected by default, not defended only after harm? At Dignity Voices, we believe quiet strength reshapes systems, and justice doesn't need an audience to be real. Like, subscribe, and share if you believe dignity belongs everywhere, not just where power expects it. This story reminds us that God's justice is not loud or vengeful. It is patient, precise, and restorative. The Bible teaches us that what is done in darkness will be brought to light, not for spectacle, but for correction. When we choose restraint over rage and integrity over performance, we make space for truth to work on our behalf. Justice doesn't shout. It builds something better and leaves it standing.